Well, thank you, Al, for taking the time to visit today. So you and AgLeader Technologies was actually one of our first 3 investors in the Ag Startup Engine. So we really appreciate that. But first, I thought I would ask you a little bit about your story, about starting AgLeader Technologies. You just were telling me that you're up to more than 100,000 square feet in space, having started out much smaller. But tell us about how you started in your garage, right? Or in your home?
Out of my home. I was an ag engineer by trade, and I worked across town at the place that's now called Dan Fawcett. It had 3 different names while I was there, and it's 2 different names. It's on its 2nd different name after that. But I was an engineer there for about 20 years, and the 1980s were some really tough times in the off-road machinery business. That they supplied many OEMs in that business, farm construction and that kind of a thing. And so I just didn't enjoy my job by sometime in the mid-1980s, and I just kept thinking, well, and there was no place to go get a job because all of their customers were on hard times as well. That's why they were on hard times.
It wasn't a real hot market for ag engineers at the time, probably.
Exactly. There was a lot of them that got laid off and probably worked outside of the ag industry because they had to have a job. But anyway, after a few years of brainstorming, I came up with the idea that I think farmers would want an on-the-go yield monitor to monitor their yields as they harvest their crops and to have records of it and that kind of a thing. And so there had been some universities doing some research. I, found a few technical papers and that kind of thing. Some people, university people throughout the world, U.S. and Europe as well, were doing a little bit of research, but nothing was really practical. So I brainstormed a number of ideas and came up with an idea I decided to try to develop, and I knew it would be a difficult development, but I intentionally chose something that was hard to do because if I could do it, then it would be hard to copy as well. So I spent my own time in evenings, weekends, holidays, vacation, etc., and my own money over a period of 6 years, and used my father, who still farmed in eastern Illinois, tested on his combine first and later with another neighbor of his, and then the last year of experimentation with a farmer here in Iowa as well. And by 1992, I decided, I think this thing is commercializable, and I had heard there was another company out there over in northern Illinois that was going to introduce a product. They had got some magazine publicity. I had kept my project completely under wraps, and I said, well, I'm going to do this. It's now or never. So I left my job, my full-time job, and in June of 1992, and said, okay, I'm AgLeader Technology, and started talking to some implement dealers, here in Iowa about. Showed them the product that I had, described what it would do, and it was a tough first year. So I only sold 10 units that first year, but I operated out of my home. But by the beginning of the next year, I realized I was going to have to start taking on some employees. You really can't do that out of your home or your garage. So that's when I rented a space not too far from here, the 1,800 square foot space that I mentioned, and started actually. Initially, my only employees were part-time Iowa State students because that's really all I could afford to
cheap and
hire.
local talent.
Yeah, cheap help when I could get them to come to work.
Yeah. So did you consider, as you're developing your product, Al, sort of prototype 1, prototype 2, or wasn't it that sort of development to get to the point where you had something that was?
There was a different prototype, both on the electronics and on the grain flow sensor, which was the key part of the development. Almost every year. I think there was one that I ran 2 years in a row. I don't remember the reason why, but yeah, it progressed from where the electronics was very crude, made from Radio Shack parts, to something that looked very much like the production final product that I introduced in 1992. So, and there were some very hard technical problems to solve in terms of how do you come up with a mechanical and how do you measure the signals to measure the grain flow accurately.
So did you have to develop software as part of that as well? Or was
yeah.
Okay.
I had a background in scientific programming with Fortran,
Sure.
and I'd had some electrical engineers that reported to me for a while out where I worked, but I didn't really know how to do electronics. I had never really been interested in it, so I had to teach myself electronics and a new type of programming, machine language, and some of that lower level type of stuff. I built my own analog circuit boards. I used single board computers because I wasn't up to the task of creating a computer board from scratch. But yeah, a lot of that 6 years was just getting myself up to speed, because I was doing it, in secrecy, because quite frankly, I probably would have been on a list of layoffs, of many layoffs that occurred through the 1980s
Sure.
if my employer had known that I was thinking about leaving.
So it was more not wanting your employer to know rather than the sort of potential competition.
Well, it was both, actually. Actually, keeping a secret was very, very valuable in terms of the competition.
Were you concerned more about another entrepreneur like you, another engineer that might be tinkering on this on the side, or were you thinking more of one of the large farm equipment companies that might be working on a project?
I was certainly concerned that there could be somebody else out there working on it. The company that did introduce a yield monitor the same year as I did, they were already in business making planter attachments, so they were more established than me. Now, their yield monitor didn't work very well because it was obvious from looking at it and hearing how it performed that it didn't have as much development in it as mine. So that company actually sold their product to a company in Minnesota, which was an established, not a large, but an established manufacturer of ag electronics, and then that concerned me a lot more. And then one thing a few years later that concerned me even more, but they ended up dropping out of the market after a few years, is that Rockwell got interested in that. They had been involved in the original military development of the GPS, and they tried to get into the ag market, interfacing. They could externally interface to my yield monitor, and they were trying to do control of fertilizer equipment, sprayers, that kind of thing at the time. But I think they realized that it wasn't, the uptake in agriculture wasn't going to be nearly as quickly, happen nearly as quickly as they expected.
Aviation doesn't equal agriculture.
Right.
Yeah, different markets.
Yeah.
Well, kind of walk us through then. First product is a yield monitor, and then how did the company progress from there?
Well, yeah, the first product for the first several years, probably the first 5 or 6 years roughly, was the yield monitor. And one thing that was very fortunate to me, not only had I developed a product that worked well, it was the right product at the right time, and that can be a key factor of success for a startup. The time was right for a couple of different reasons. It was the right idea to get the interest of farmers. I mean, it took a while to really catch on, but in terms of precision farming products, the yield monitor was the earliest product. It wasn't the first precision farming product, but it was the earliest hardware product that gained widespread acceptance. Steering came along later, and is very widely accepted and is usable on more ag machines, but that came a little later.
So why do you think that widespread adoption of yield monitors happened?
Well, for one thing, and this is one of the reasons I thought farmers would want it, is yield is the farmer's paycheck. And they pay a lot of attention to that. You know, they like, historically, they would use average yields of plots to choose their hybrids for next year and that kind of thing. And one thing, after yield monitors got into the field, and I didn't really know it before and nobody did, everybody found that there was more yield variation going across the field than you expected. In the beginning, it was not uncommon to in some years see 2 to 1 or even more yield variation, and often you can't see that visually from the combine cab. So,
and I remember riding with a farmer at that time, and even though I was there, he had more conversation going with his yield monitor than he did with me about some of those issues of variability.
Right. So yeah, it caught on well, and that was fortunate I had the right product at the right time.
how did you begin to think about additional products then?
Well, I could see that, I didn't envision in the beginning everything that's happened in precision farming. But as GPS came along, and when I started the company, GPS was basically not usable. The system had not been declared operational. There were people that were trying to use it, and it would only work during certain hours of the day. It wasn't very accurate. Would have a lot of erroneous points that would show up in your maps. But as that became much better over the years, and other uses, and I won't say that we necessarily pioneered all of those, but it just gradually became more and more obvious that this GPS technology was going to be used for many things, for primarily moving into controlling. Steering in the came about in the late 1990s or early 2000s, and also had a very rapid adoption. Variable rate planter control, variable rate fertilization has had a slow adoption. Variable rate fertilization, I think, was actually the first precision farming hardware product back about 1984, I think, with a company called Soil Tech. But the variable rate technology is still on a steady, but it's been on a much slower adoption curve. And as time went on, it just, everyone recognized there was just more and more you could do with this electronics and GPS technology.
Yeah. Well, tell us about the business today.
Well, today we're a little smaller than we were a few years ago because we reached a peak sales, as did almost all companies in ag, in 2013, and then grain prices slowed us down a little bit. But today we're about 300 employees, and about 250 of them are here in Ames. The remaining employees are primarily field salespeople throughout North America. We also have 3 foreign offices, one in Brazil, one in Australia, and one in Europe. So we do business pretty much throughout the world, not every country, but we do business on all continents except, I guess, Antarctica. Not too many
Very
crops.
good. Very good. Well, I mentioned that you were one of the first investors in the Ag Startup Engine. Can you tell us why you made that decision to be a part of that effort?
Well, I'd say there's a couple of reasons. One, I thought it would be interesting just to be in the know on what's going on with this effort to create more startups here associated with Ames and Iowa State University. And I also thought it might be good to kind of have an inside line on what some of these startups are doing, so that I'd have an early indication, is there one of these companies that maybe AgLeader wants to consider having a relationship with initially, or possibly in the future, that kind of thing. I didn't enter it quite frankly, with the expectation to make money.
Well, we'll see what can happen there.
We'll see what happens.
Very good. Well, the Ag Startup Engine is about ag tech opportunities, which is what your company has been about on the first edge, really, of precision agriculture, here in the United States. As you think about the most compelling opportunities for agricultural technologies going forward, whether it's in precision agriculture or anything else, what's most interesting or compelling to you?
Well, certainly there's an explosion of information-related technologies, because with the internet and with all the data that is being gathered, or data that hasn't been gathered that can be gathered with modern electronics and wireless connectivity and cloud storage, that kind of thing. We're doing some things in that arena, and I see a lot of these startups several of these startups are doing things in that area. And I think there's obviously many large and many startup companies pursuing that, and they won't all be successful, but I do see that there are big opportunities for the companies that do the right things to basically make information more available, or maybe more importantly, more usable by the end user, whether that's the crop farmer or the livestock farmer, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we certainly generate a lot of data today for farmers. But the question in my mind, and maybe in some others, is can you make decisions that change anything using that data? And I think it's better today than it was 10 years ago, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about where that goes.
It needs to get better. There is tons and tons of data out there, particularly yield data that's some farmers have more than 20 years of yield data, but have done very little with it other than it's interesting to look at. But many of the farmers are not capable of doing sophisticated analysis. Some use consultants who are quite good that use that data to make recommendations on hybrids, fertilizer rates, variable rate planting or fertilization, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of farmers that have data that could be used that isn't used, and I think that's where some of the people that do the right things in the area of creating useful information that the farmer can use and act on is an opportunity. I think another opportunity, just in maybe more in the area of, I shouldn't say only in that area, but both in the hardware and the data area, is making the technology easier to use, so to speak. Because some of this technology is difficult for many of the people out there.
Yeah, a farmer friend of mine with a big farm said somebody in ag technology had said that they estimated that only 50% of the capabilities of precision agriculture are used by most farmers. So he went to the leader of his operation and said, what percentage do you suppose we use? And he said like 40 to 50% or something.
I'm surprised he said that. To be honest with you. I think the number might even be lower. A lot of people using it, but are they using it to its potential, I think is the question.
So opportunities and challenges around using data, around making the technology easier to use and more accessible and more usable. Any other challenges for agricultural technology as you look at the next 5 to 10 years?
When you say challenges or
challenges? And sometimes challenges are opportunities as well.
Well, one challenge with all this ag tech stuff is the adoption rate, and that gets into not only making it easier to use. Many of the decision makers on farms, crop farms in particular, are older and they're afraid of technology. I've known farmers who said, I don't touch a computer. I don't want anything to do with it. Maybe they learn to use their yield monitor, their steering in their tractor and so on, but and I've known farmers that there's additional things they can do in the area of their hardware and their machinery, but they're afraid to move into it for their fear they won't know how to use it properly, or they'll do something wrong. Particularly when you're controlling something, when you're monitoring something, if something goes wrong, you just lose some information. But if you're controlling something and you mess up your crops, that's a different situation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that variable rate fertilization has been slow from an adoption perspective. Well, I've heard some comment that some of the problems with some agricultural technologies and adoption is that there isn't a clear value proposition. Well, it seems to me like variable rate fertilization is one of those precision agriculture sort of value propositions that actually is quite clear.
Right.
So in that case, is that just an adoption and sort of ease of use and changing farming practices, or what is it that holds something specific like that up?
I would say the farmers that recognize the value and either they can handle the analysis and create good prescriptions for themselves, or they work with a good agronomist advisor who they trust and know, have confidence, does that. I know there's a lot of farmers that do variable rate fertilization. I can speak to probably my tenant on my former parents' farms over in Illinois. I think he has that done, but I think he just trusts the local co-op to do it. He doesn't have a close advisor necessarily, but there's always I think in some farmers' concern, and other people's as well, does the co-op really have the interest in reducing the farmers'
input use?
Because
they're selling
fertilizer.
It's a good question.
Yeah,
a good question. So Al, you're a very successful entrepreneur. Classic story of starting in your home, taking a lot of time to develop something and coming out with a better solution that wins in the marketplace, and then building your business around that. But when you think of some of the other high-impact entrepreneurial people you met, what are some of their common characteristics or some of their skills, some of the ways that they behave, perhaps things that you admire or even try to imitate?
Well, I would say in general, and I see that in some of these people in the ag startup engine, that an entrepreneur has to, you might say, have the foresight or the insight to pick the right opportunity. There's a lot of people that start mundane businesses, like you might say restaurants. How many restaurants start up and go out of business?
Yeah.
Because somebody would like to have a restaurant, but there really isn't. They really can't make it go business-wise. So picking the right opportunity is very important, and I do see that in several of these people that are involved in the ag startup engine. I'd say I don't know if it's a skill or just a natural behavior that I see in these entrepreneurs, which is one that I really don't have or didn't have, is networking.
Okay.
These guys network a lot, and because to understand, are they doing the right thing? Who are their customers? Who should they hire into their businesses? How do they get investment? That kind of a thing. So, yeah, I would say picking the right opportunities and networking in today's world is very important. When I started my business, it was a completely different world. If I tried to network about this kind of stuff, I wouldn't be able to find anybody to talk to. Hardly.
Yeah. Well, as you think about, from a business perspective, some of the most important lessons that you've learned, what would those be that you can share?
Well, I'd say one lesson I learned very quickly after I started the company is what I call talk is cheap. You can go talk to somebody and they say, yeah, this looks like a good idea. I think I can sell some of these, or, I probably would buy this product, but later on, when it comes down to them putting their money down or doing something, then it's a little different situation. So that's, I think, I know I've seen in some of the presentations of the startup companies that were looking for funding by the Ag Startup Engine, I looked at, they were just grossly optimistic in terms of how fast they could grow their business.
Yeah.
And that comes from my, what I experienced in the start of my business. It's going to be a really slow start, especially when you're unknown with an unknown product, that type of thing.
How many years did it take before you felt like, okay, this business is going to make it? Was it?
I would say it happened fairly quick for me because the adoption curve ramped up pretty quickly. I would say after 2 years, in the third year, I was clearly to the point, this business is going to make it. Yeah. After the first season, there were some questions in my mind. How do I? Of course, I had no external funding other than I did borrow some money from my father. And I think I had a bank loan where I put up a car as collateral at one point.
That's not too big of a loan.
Yeah, not too big of a loan. So it was tough getting by. So there was certainly some question. But after 2 years, it was clear things were on a rapid upswing. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, tell me about a situation where you've overcome a significant challenge. How did you do it? Maybe tell us as much about that challenge and what methods or tools or other people were helpful in you overcoming that obstacle.
Well, there's obviously been lots and lots of challenges, but as I think back and getting the company going, I would say the first challenge was me figuring out how am I going to survive between the first and the second season.
Okay.
Because I had a product that was only used in the fall, because I was only here in Iowa initially and expanding into the Corn Belt. I guess I sold a couple units in Texas that second year, but primarily here in the upper Midwest. My product worked well, but I had a problem with a couple of the first users of the system on the then current John Deere combine models. And that problem was that it could plug up the clean grain elevator of the combine when you got into high yielding wet corn, which there was a lot of in Iowa that year.
Yeah.
Had an early frost, it didn't dry down well, but yet it was very high yield. So I know I had one system up in northern Iowa that I had to take back. And there was actually the guy that did the last prototype test here in Iowa, and before he started the company, he had a system, and I spent a lot of time with him trying to solve that problem, while he was still harvesting. It was a very long, extended harvest because the corn just did not dry down below 30% for him all season long.
So a farmer calls you up and says, this thing's creating a problem for me. Like the corn's not.
The one I took back, he called me up and left a very direct and blunt and not so nice message on my answering machine. It was, get up here and get this thing off my combine now.
Probably with a few other words mixed in.
That was actually a loaner demo system, loaned on the idea that if he liked it, he would buy it. And he was also a guy that had a bit of a temper as well. I found out. So that was painful. But for me, then I actually went down and talked to somebody in the research park. I don't remember how I got connected there. Not a business, but somebody running the research park or involved in running it. And basically said, okay, I'm starting this business. I have this problem that I can't sell the system for these certain combines, which look like they're going to be the most popular combines I can sell on, because I hadn't yet, or I was in the process of starting to make them available for other brands like the Case IH, the New Holland, the Gleaner, the Massey Fergusons, and so on. I said, most of my sales, I have this problem, and I can't sell these systems until I solve this problem. And whoever it was I was talking to said, well, without external funding, you're trying to do it yourself. You got to have some cash flow. So I went back, and basically he was telling me, you just can't sit and work on your engineering problem and not sell anything for a while. You're not going to make it. I went back and thought about that, and I said, he's right. So what I had to do is I actually sold systems that I knew I was going to need to recall and change a component, the grain flow sensor, before the farmer used it in the field. And I was, one thing that helped me get going is I was aligned with a couple of software companies that were trying to make some of the early mapping software, and so that second year out, we did have the opportunity to make some early sales in the spring and summer. And so with the advice I got down there at the research park, I went back and I said, okay, I got to keep making products, so I did, and sell it when I can. But I also got to solve this problem. So I got busy, and my first employee actually helped me build a stationary test stand with part of a combine on it. And we did some intensive testing, and I figured out how to change the grain flow sensor so we could run high flows of wet corn through it and still measure accurately and not plug up the combine and cause mechanical problems on the combine.
So then get them all changed.
So then in the summertime, and the reason I remember I sold a couple of units in Texas, and those were for those late model Deere combines. They were going to start harvesting corn in, I think, about the 1st of August or something. So that was my deadline that I had to start getting these replacement flow sensors out there in the field. But it worked out, and my sales the first year was only like 10 units, and we ramped up to about 125 units the second year and had good success, and that put us on a springboard to the market was starting to recognize the product, and I think we grew to 500 units the next year.
So, Al, you seem to me like a heavy engineering personality, and you're an engineer, right?
Yes.
This makes sense.
Yeah.
And somebody helped you recognize, okay, you're not thinking enough like a salesperson, but you did that,
Yeah.
right? But how else did you overcome that as you grew the company? Was it just by understanding that you needed to have a sales team, or?
Well, yeah, the first year out, I just tried to sell through some John Deere dealers in Iowa, and actually, I only sold 2 of the 10 units through John Deere dealers.
Okay, that didn't work very well.
Yeah, and that's where I learned the talk is cheap thing, because a lot of them said, no, this looks good and interesting, I think I can sell some. Well, the only 2 that sold one was because several of these dealers did allow me to go to their combine clinics that they would hold just ahead of the harvest to remind their farmers how to adjust things and that kind of thing. So I got to stand up and speak, and had a display there and a flow sensor to show them. And there were 2 farmers at 2 different dealers that were so intrigued they decided to buy one through their dealer. All the rest were through personal contacts that I knew, or one or 2 came through Lee Klein, the former ag person at WHO Radio, did a radio interview with me, and 1 or 2 people heard that and found out what my phone number was, and said, I want one of those.
That's great.
But certainly, yeah, my previous career, I had been a very techie engineering type person. That's why I was able to create a product that worked well, but I really didn't know anything about sales and marketing. And I remember one of the managers out there, that he wasn't the manager I worked for when I resigned, but I remember him telling, well, you don't know anything about sales and marketing. Dismissed, well, how important is that? Well, it turns out it's real important. But, and actually, I went, as part of my contact with the research part, I did ask, well, how do I sell this product? And there I got some bad advice, which I immediately recognized was bad advice. Whoever I was talking to over there, had a grad student look into it, and they basically came back and said, well, go talk to this company out of Omaha. And I knew the company because I'd seen their displays and farm equipment dealerships. They basically sold bolts and washers and that kind of stuff. And I immediately knew that's not the kind of company that sell a product that's so higher tech than a farmer has ever been exposed to. So how I started to catch on how you do this marketing, I did do my first farm show in early December of 1992, the first year after the harvest season. And I started to run into these people that would stop by my booth and say, what is this thing? And turns out they were independent manufacturers' representatives, which I was dumb enough about sales and marketing to not even know they existed. There were these people that their business was for a % commission. They act as your salesperson in a territory to call on dealers and set up a dealer network. And I started taking on those people, and that in the early days of the yield monitor, before the OEMs had their own yield monitor products, the equipment dealers were seeing that their customers were looking for this kind of product, and so we had a good uptake of farm equipment dealers becoming our dealers through those independent manufacturers' representatives. Now, eventually, as we grew, we let all those people go and took on our own full-time employees that we have today.
Well, eventually you started a marketing department because you hired away an employee that I had at Decision Commodities, Jessica Reese.
Oh, well, and she left us for
mayor. She did. She did.
Yeah, she was a good employee. We did start we had a sales department.
2005, 2006,
we
something
didn't really have a marketing department for a while. And I guess how that got started, I hired a guy. He was the same age as me. He had been let go when DuPont acquired Pioneer, and he was a marketing guy there. I hired him to be a sales and marketing manager. And and he had a sales manager who reported to him. And so that was kind of the start. He actually retired because his wife inherited so much money, he didn't want to work, so he decided he didn't need to drive up from Des Moines every day. And it wasn't
it's a good reason.
he wasn't lazy. He was going to do a lot of charity work.
Sure.
I think he was, I don't know if he still does it, I haven't seen him for a long time. He was going to be the blacksmith in Living History Farm's blacksmith shop or something like that.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, you make me feel better. The first company that I started, eMarkets, we showed a prototype of an electronic commerce application on the internet. This is 1997, so it was brand new.
Wow.
And they pointed to it and said, can you build that by September? This is in August. So my partner, Dave Krogh, was beginning to think aloud, and he's more careful than I am. Yeah. And I said, shh, Dave. And I said, yes. But I had no idea. Yeah. So we sold something before we had any idea that it would work. But it did.
You did the sales.
Yeah, I did the sales. Yeah. So deals are a part of the process of building a company as well, whether it's a transaction, maybe to get a key supplier, maybe a deal around distribution, maybe buying another company or something like that. Are there any, what's the most interesting deal that you can think of that you've ever made, and how did it come about?
Well, probably, I've made a lot of deals. We do supply to several OEM companies today. We did make one acquisition of a company that makes tile plows. Not that we wanted to be in the machinery business, but I wanted the sister company that made the tile plow control product that was patented and proprietary. I would say probably the most interesting deal was the first big deal that I did, and that came along very early, and I wasn't out looking for this deal, but Case Corporation, this was back prior to Case New Holland, when it was just Case IH approached me and about creating an OEM version of the yield, my original yield monitor, for them to offer from their factory on their combines. And that was, they approached me, I started the company in June of '92, and they approached me in late 1994, so only about 2.5 years after I started the company, and I was still in the throes of just trying to handle everything to grow the company. Between, I was still doing all the purchasing. I had, I think in 1993, I hired my first full-time employee. He was a technician, and he was hired just to build product because I didn't have enough time from the students that were working part-time. But, and in '94, he was, I had hired a few full-time assembly people, but no full-time professional people yet, so I was just really totally consumed with pretty much running everything in the company and the growth. But approached by Case Corporation, and it was a good opportunity. They wanted to move very quickly because they wanted to be the first company in the business to offer a yield monitor auction from the factory, and they did by March of 1996. So that piled even more work on me.
Big order.
Because we had to create a custom version for them, and I hadn't even hired any. I'd hired an engineering helper. I'd hired my first person with a college degree in the beginning of '95, and he wasn't from Iowa State, but he would be like an AST grad here at Iowa State. So he helped me on some engineering stuff, but.
So when we did our first deal with DuPont, small division of DuPont called Optimum Quality Grains, we were moving towards getting it, and they said, well, we want to come and visit your Ames office. We'd never exactly told them that we had an Ames office, but we kept driving down there to their office in Urbandale. No, that's fine. But finally, they were really insistent. No, we want to come to your place.
To your place.
So we had to find an office. And so Reddy Friedrich let us have this place. And so we're getting Office Depot furniture and our folding tables from home. And it's like, here's our office. Anyway, did you have that as well? You have Case, a big established company coming to see you.
We had a place of business.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was a small place of business. But
get all your student interns there at once to look busy.
Whoever was there was there.
Okay.
But it was very frugal because at that point, and actually for several years after that, until we moved into the building we're in now, standard issue office furniture for everyone was 2 folding tables and a chair from Sam's Club, literally, and a computer.
Yeah,
that was your standard issue, and so it was frugal, and I'm sure it looked pretty crude to those people. But yeah, so I worked with them very hard during the whole 1995 year to get. I think they bought about 65 systems for them to put out with customers and test, and that all worked out well, and then it was get ready for production starting in March of '96. And of course, in a big company like them, they felt they were turning the world over compared to the speed that they normally would, and I'm sure from their standpoint it was. But it was also a lot of effort on my part, and that's the point where I realized I got to hire an operations manager because I can't do all the engineering and do all the high-level supervision of all the assembly operations, do all the purchasing myself, and so I hired an operations manager basically to do the purchasing and run the shop floor, so I could focus on the you might say the technical side. And I think it was '96. Shortly after we went into production with Case, I started hiring some engineers.
Okay.
But one of the things the reason I say it was most interesting, I found out after the fact, the fellow who lined up the deal with me, who approached me, he'd been with them along quite a number of years, and he was a very good guy to work with. But he told me after the fact that the other company that I mentioned that had a yield monitor the same year, although they'd actually sold out to this established company in Minnesota, who was not large but certainly bigger than me, they were very close to making a decision to go with that company.
Wow.
And where I wasn't talking to any OEMs. I wasn't looking.
You were not marketing it to them.
I didn't know it was a possibility at that point in time. Wasn't thinking about it, but this guy told me that they shared their plans with some of the implement dealers, their key dealers, because the machinery companies have dealer councils and that kind of thing, and the dealers said, well, that's the wrong thing. You should use the one that works well. That's the AgLeader unit. Apparently, that's why he came to talk to me.
It's positive customer feedback loop, essentially.
Yeah. So.
Was it difficult to come to terms with a large company like that when you have such a small business, or did that come about in a reasonably?
No, they were very good to work with.
Yeah.
I'm sure for them, they were probably wondering what they were doing working with a company with such small resources and facilities like that. But I guess they recognized, okay, the product worked, the farmers knew it worked, and that was the best option, and we're going to do it. And certainly, one beneficial thing to me is that started to expose me to first to just business contract negotiations, because we did negotiate a fairly extensive formal contract, negotiated prices, and of course they always want price reductions, and we did our best to reduce our costs and give them cost reductions. But also exposure to the quality expectations of the OEMs, which is a level above what what you can get by with an aftermarket product. And I always believed in good quality products. Certainly I'd done it from an engineering standpoint, But then ensuring consistent high quality and high volumes on a production basis is a different ballgame.
Essentially building a quality manufacturing process.
Right, exactly.
From a bench, by hand sort of process.
Yeah, and we've dealt with a number of OEMs, and over the years, it's just, that has gradually built up our abilities to basically be, you might say, world-class quality.
Yeah, that's great. Well, one of the things I notice about entrepreneurial people is that they continually try to learn new things and do it a different way and gain insights. So as you think about the best ways for you to gain insights, is it by meeting people or books, media, conferences, things that you read, places that you go?
Well, I'm not a book reader, so that's not it.
Okay.
I read some books when I was, before I started the company on, just entrepreneurial ideas, and I got a few things out of that. But I don't read books unless I feel I really need to learn something that's in that book. And I'm not a big networker, as I said earlier. I used to go to some conferences, but I don't do much of that anymore. With the internet these days, I find that the online media is really the way that I can stay up with a lot of what's happening in the world, and technical trends, business trends, those kind of things. So online media is my primary source for trying to keep tabs of what's going on in the world. I even like to read science newsletters, not what are the latest developments in astrophysics. It has nothing to do with my company. That kind of thing. So that's primarily what I use.
Are there any particular websites for your industry that you find useful?
Well, one, I think that most everyone certainly in the precision farming world follows. It's actually run by farmers. It's called New Ag Talk, and they have a number of different forums. There's like machinery talk, crop talk, market talk, and there's one precision talk. So that's a good one to watch, to see what are farmers doing, what do farmers like about different people's products, including mine, or don't like, that kind of a thing. That's probably the number one website. But I get I'm on a number of industry-related newsletters, like from some of the magazines. And, they publish news articles and so on, and that's probably more valuable than just understanding who's doing what. Who's partnered with who, and that kind of a thing in the industry. Stuff that's in a press release, but I wouldn't see it otherwise necessarily. Yeah.
Well, let's just conclude today with some quick fire questions, Al, if that's all right. First, what's your earliest memory of agriculture?
Well, since I grew up on a crop and livestock farm, my earliest memories would be, I guess, anything that I can remember when I was young. I know, I can think back. I didn't know it when I was young, but I was destined to become work in the machinery field and be an engineer, because I was always interested in my dad's farm machinery. I mean, obviously I observed the livestock and the crops, but I have some pretty early memories of the machinery on my dad's farm, and I haven't told this story for a long time, but I'm pretty sure that when I turned 6 years old, I asked my mom if I could have a tractor. We had a neighbor who had one of these little Ford tractors, these little low ones. My dad had bigger tractors that had the much bigger wheels, and I thought those little Ford tractors looked like really cute things, and this neighbor would stop by and drive it down the road and stop in our driveway, and I'd look out there and see that. And my mom said, well, maybe in a couple of years. So
Not a bicycle, I want a tractor.
So when I was 8, I wanted to know where my tractor was. Didn't understand reality then.
Was your dad a farm mechanic kind of a guy?
He was a poor farmer in the beginning. He started with virtually nothing. He was youngest child when my grandfather was old enough to retire at 70 or something like that, and so My dad was the last one. All his other brothers were long gone, and his other brothers were a lot older than him, so they'd been gone for a while. So,
well, I remember, it may not be quite my earliest, but it's early. My grandfather, who farmed, pointing at either a 4010 or 4020 John Deere.
yeah.
And he said, Kevin, if you farm, I'll give you that tractor. And boy, to a little boy,
Yeah.
that is a big deal. And then, I don't know, a few years later, they traded it for another tractor. And I was, as far as a little boy goes, it's like, Grandpa doesn't want me to farm anymore. Oh my goodness, what the heck?
Yeah.
But yeah, you look at those tractors, and it's a very aspirational thing when you're little. What's your memory of the first money that you made?
Well, I think when I was maybe in 7th and 8th grade, I know at one point, of course I lived in the country, so they're, and not old enough to drive into town and do things. My parents were always busy on the farm, not a lot of opportunities, but I can remember for $3 every Sunday I would mow a neighbor lady's yard. It was like a half a mile away, and even though I wasn't old enough to drive, I'd throw a push mower in the back of my dad's farm truck and go over there and
Could drive that
mow
far.
it, and she'd give me $3. That was in the summer, and in the wintertime, this would not be a popular thing today, I actually trapped muskrats in local ditches and skinned them and sold the pelts.
Okay, how much did they go for?
Not very much.
I was going to say it's probably like cents or something.
It was about maybe $1
Oh,
a
okay.
piece. Yeah.
All right.
So I might make $30 to $50 a season.
Yeah,
It was pretty good money in, like 1960 or 61.
nobody complained about getting rid of those, I don't think. Huh? Who've been some of the most influential people in your career?
Well, I would say I can't point to any one person who's the most influential, but I would say some of the managers that I worked under out at the place that's now called Danfoss, where I worked for 20 years out there, because I could observe managers who were very good at building loyalty in their people and getting a good team going versus those that weren't. And I recall one manager, he was a director of engineering out there for a while. He was very good at quickly seeing through you might say the clutter when you got problems or decisions to make. You can have a lot of clutter in your mind, or some people just can't see through the forest to see the trees that count, so to speak. And so I would say that over a period of time, I learned some good principles from them. I know I was made a supervisor only 5 years into my career. Typically, for the reason that most engineers are made supervisors, they were good engineers.
Yeah.
Turned out to be a terrible supervisor. I was a micromanager, and when one guy who had a hot temper blew up and said, "You can literally take this job and shove it," and my manager had a discussion with me, and I pretty quickly realized, oh yeah, I wouldn't like that either. So.
Okay. Learned how to put yourself in his shoes.
Yeah. So I would say that, some of those managers, management doesn't come natural to me. I'm a techie person, so.
Sure.
But I certainly observed some things there about managing people or making business decisions that I think were useful in my starting up AgLeader and keeping it going.
Yeah. Well, the last question, we work in agriculture, but the end result of our efforts at some point is food. So I thought I'd ask, what's your favorite meal or food experience that you can share?
Well, I would say my tastes are pretty simple. As much as anything, I enjoy a good old corn-fed steak.
Okay. Which cut of steak? Do you have a preference?
Something that's good and tender. I don't care otherwise.
Okay. Ribeye, sirloin, whatever.
Yeah,
Very good.
Exactly.
Good. Oh, thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.